So moving on then, in Sloterdijk to the next chapter. Technically it's chapter 1, Heart Operation, or on the Eucharistic excess, but it's also preceded by another chapter called Preliminary Reflections on Thinking the Interior. And in this set of preliminary reflections, what Sloterdijk does is he goes on to create his theory of the subject, and basically it's an ingenious theory of the subject in that the subject is formed, he'll say in this book, by gobbling up other selves. That's one simple way of putting it. Of course, it's more elaborate than that, but that's basically what it amounts to. The subject is formed through the ingestion of other selves. It's a little bit analogous to Lynn Margulis's theory. Lynn Margulis was a bacteriologist who developed the theory that the cells in evolution originated as the result of an endosymbiotic process, a process of what she called cellular symbiosis, whereby cells, the modern cell of the body, came into being by gobbling up other cells. For example, blue-green cyanobacteria that invented photosynthesis were gobbled up by larger cells, and those cells could not digest the earlier cells, and so they became permanent components, organelles basically. They became the chloroplasts inside plant cells that allow them to photosynthesize. Same thing with aerobic bacteria. Those bits of aerobic bacteria were then later gobbled up by other cells of larger bacteria that could not digest them, and they became the mitochondria in the cells of animals that allow them to respire oxygen. And so the architecture of the cell as we know it today is actually built up out of cells gobbling up, swallowing other cells. And basically what Sloterdijk is doing in this book is a sort of philosophical equivalent of this idea, a metaphysical equivalent that the self forms in the West by gobbling up other selves. He starts off in the chapter on preliminary reflections by saying that there are these two different ideas of the ego, the two different ideas of the self. There's the idea of the Cartesian cogito, which is the self that exists as a sort of extensionless point in space that panoptically surveys all phenomena and sees all phenomena as beneath it, and itself as transcendent and outside of all phenomena, which it surveys like a disembodied entity from above, and incorporates into itself and dominates over phenomena. Then there's the opposite type, the Jonah, what he calls the Jonah self, the self that, like Jonah, is swallowed up in the belly of the whale. And he says that Wilhelm Steckel, the psychologist, Wilhelm Steckel, described the fantasies of a 13-year-old boy whereby the boy saw himself as being inside the abdominal cavity of a giant woman, inside which he got onto a swing and just swung back and forth without ever disturbing the equilibrium of the interior. So that's a different kind of self. So you can have the self is always being contained in other selves and containing other selves. So it's a paradox. And he says that the subject in Western psychology occupies spaces that are not accessible or translatable into the spaces of physics. This isn't the realm of chemistry and geometry. This is the realm of the self, and it's an interior space, a space that emerges on the inside, as it were, of subjectivity. And he says that in contradistinction to this very strong, assertive, aggressive idea of the Western masculine self, he's more interested in this idea of a hollow self. Now, if you hold in your mind the image of the Adam figurine that he introduced in the previous chapter on the breathed commune, Adam was the hollow figurine that God blew his breath into, then he wants you to have this idea in your mind that the body and the self is empty and fills itself and develops, evolutionizes, evolves, and develops through incorporating other entities. And he talks about how this should be opposed to the traditional Western idea of the dominant, aggressive self. He says that one way of thinking of this, just as a kind of strange example, is to think of how in literature the great, strong, aggressive hero is never offered sweets. You don't offer sweets to the hero because the phenomenological effects of eating candy are that the candy hollows you out, and it puts the hero, who prefers the sharp to the sweet, it renders him a bystander, shoves him as a subjectivity aside, while the triumphal march of the sweetness parades down the center of his psyche and completely overtakes and consumes him. And he becomes a bystander. And so Sloterdijk says, so what does this do to the Western idea of the autonomous, self-governing self? It renders it possibly null. and the self becomes a bystander. And so, but his idea of the self is precisely this idea that the self fills itself with other entities, other things. And it begins early on from infancy with the child suckling on the mother's breast, and the breast is incorporated, as it were, inside of it. Then you have candy later on in life. And it's interesting, too, that in German, the title of this book, Bubbles, is Blasen, and in German that's apparently a slang for a blowjob. So there again we have the idea of the self incorporating alien or foreign elements of other selves into it. The self is permeable for Sloterdijk. It's constantly incorporating the exterior world, just as civilizational macrospheres are constantly pulling inside them elements from the exterior world of actual space. So the philosophical self, the philosophical subject, is constantly developing by pulling in other entities, other beings, other phenomena, and developing and getting larger and growing and diversifying, so that self is composed of all these different lateral spaces and compartments and components, and it's a very complex model of the self. It's nothing like the Western solid monad, the cogito, that dominates phenomena. So this is a kind of, note that this is a kind of feminization of the self, this idea of a hollow self, a receptive self. It's a completely different kind of idea of the subject. So rather than doing away with the subject, as Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida and most of the French did, Sloterdijk belongs, I think, in the camp with philosophers like Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, who are trying to retain the subject in philosophy and not just do away with it. But this is an ingenious idea of the subject forming itself by gobbling other selves. So then if we move on then into Chapter 1, which is heart operation, or on the Eucharistic excess. He gives concrete examples of this from literature, where he shows how this process took place in European history. And he starts off with the example of a text from Conrad of Würzburg's Heart Fable, which is a 13th century courtly love text, which describes the fable of the traditional courtly love romance of the knight and the woman that he loves. The two are in love, and of course, as in the case of Tristan and Isolde and King Mark, there's the jealous husband. And so the jealous husband is going to consign the woman to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre in Asia, in the Middle East basically, and she doesn't want to go, so she convinces the knight to go in her stead, and he agrees to this reluctantly, but he agrees to do it, and he takes her ring. Note that the ring, Sloterdijk doesn't mention this, but the reason why the ring is on the third finger of the hand is because the ancients thought that there was a nerve that connected the third finger directly to the heart. And so this is why the third finger in marriage becomes the host for the ring. One's heart belongs intersubjectively to another in Sloterdijkian microspherological fashion. So he goes on this quest to the Holy Land. He goes to the quest and he dies there. But before he dies, he gives to his squire specific instructions to cut open his chest and take out his heart, and also take the ring back to his beloved. So the squire does this and goes back to Europe, and he comes to the castle, and the husband, I guess, answers the door, and he figures out pretty quickly what's going on. So he says, I'll handle this package. So he takes the package with the heart in it, and he decides to carve it up, and he cuts it up, and he puts it in a soup, cooks it in the kitchen, and then he feeds it to his wife. She unknowingly then consumes the heart of her beloved. Then after she's done this, the jealous husband tells her what's happened. She goes white, and she basically renounces food and dies as the result of that. That sort of heartbreak. But now what Sloterdijk wants to draw your attention to, of course, here is this idea that, number one, the basic idea of courtly love is to take over the idea of the Eucharist, the sacrament here in which one eats the body of Christ in the form of the wafer. That is transposed to the profane sphere of secular worldly love, in which the two pair, the lover and the beloved, are analogous to, they become holy subjects, as it were, in profanity, in the realm of the banal. And instead of the eating of the Eucharist, we have the eating of the heart. So we have a transposition. The kitchen becomes the altar in which the miracle of transubstantiation takes place. And so we have an appropriation into the banal sphere, into the sphere of the courtly love romances, from the Eucharistic sphere. So he calls this a Eucharistic excess. But it's also the idea, it's a concrete illustration of the idea that the self is formed by ingesting other selves into its world interior, into its intimate space. So what Sloterdijk is doing in this book is, of course, an archaeology of intimacy, of intimate spaces, and he sees the interior of the psyche as something very vacant, as something empty that requires being filled by an other personage, so that the self is always bipolar, it's always biune, or even multipolar, but it always desires to incorporate another's essence into it, to become a subject. So he gives that example, and then he moves on to the example of the mystic Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena was a woman who had her heart torn out. Jesus comes to her and opens her up, her left side, and takes her heart out and walks away with it. She goes to confession and she tells the priest that she feels empty inside. There's a vacancy there, or a semiotic vacancy as I would call it. And her heart is gone. And then in visionary rapture, in a trance state, Jesus comes back to her, opens up her side, and gives her his heart and says, here, put this inside of you. And she puts his heart inside of her and seals it up, and now she has the heart of Christ inside of her. So once again, we have the idea of the self. In this case, we have the self gobbling up the heart of another. One heart is placed inside the other. So we're always containing other people inside of us without even realizing it. So in the first case, we have the example of the microsphere formed by the pair of lovers who are connected by the imitation of the Eucharist, the consumption of the heart. And in the second case, we have the mystical woman who receives the heart of God, and the mystical relationship of the microsphere that forms between the deity and the human being in that second case. Then he gives a third example, and he says that in this third example, this is from a text of Marsilio Ficino, which is a commentary on Platonic love, in which Marsilio Ficino talks about these two individuals, one named Lysias and the other Phaedrus. Phaedrus is the younger man, Lysias is the older man. And Lysias falls in love with Phaedrus in good Greek fashion in the following manner. Effluences from the heart of the younger man, Phaedrus, come up from his heart and enter out through his eyes and penetrate the eyes of Lysias, and that substance intermixes with his own blood and goes down to his heart, so that now he is to be regarded as having the blood of Phaedrus inside him, and that blood wants to get back to Phaedrus's heart, and that's experienced as infatuation. Lysias's infatuation for Phaedrus is the blood that has entered through the eyes of Lysias in good Platonic fashion. Plato has the idea of the radiation of effluences through the eyes, wants to get back to him, and this is the phenomenon of infatuation. So once again, we have the formation of a microsphere in which individuals become inter-involved holonically or holonomically, one inside the other. We're always taking people's psyches inside of our own psyches, and they're taking us inside of them to form these microspheres. This is the concrete way for Sloterdijk in which microspheres form between human beings. And then finally, he gives the final example in this chapter of La Mettrie's idea, who comes along in the 18th century and says that man is basically a machine. So he comes up with the mechanistic model that gets rid of all these metaphysical ideas, and basically William Harvey in the 17th century had discovered that the heart wasn't the king of all the organs of the body, but was simply one other muscle that was responsible for circulating the blood. So we have this disenchantment of the world, the disenchantment of the heart, and the elevation of the corpse now. The corpse becomes the central specimen on the anatomy table, and in dissecting the corpse we find that the individual is a unit, an anatomical unit that supports the Cartesian cogito of the unique self that exists independently and in separation from all other selves. So the corpse becomes the anchor, the model now. The dissected corpse, the spiritually vacant corpse, becomes the model for the separate self. And this is what happens in the 18th century with La Mettrie, who then, with the idea of the disenchanted heart as merely a muscle, merely a machine, all of these ideas about the intimate space are chased out. They're exiled from the interior space, the interior microsphere. They're exiled from it by this idea that the individual is complete unto himself and does not require relationships with others in which they are incorporated inside of him and vice versa. And so the mechanistic paradigm comes in the 18th century and begins to put an end to this older idea of the heart as being inter-involved intersubjectively with others. And so, just as a brief recap then of this chapter, these are the basic ideas of Sloterdijk's theory of the subject that he puts forth in this next chapter. I think it's quite a brilliant and interesting one, and it's a philosophical equivalent of Lynn Margulis's theory of cellular symbiosis through the process of cells gobbling up other cells.